Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
I'm your co-host, Rich Gear, here with you, and we're ready to talk about kind of a controversial subject, Doug, Nazi Germany, and Jerry Bergman's newest and latest foray into the Darwinian wars, if you will. You know, he's amazing.
First of all, I want to deal with the false claim that Hitler was actually doing the thing. His stuff was motivated because he was a Christian. Can you imagine him doing all this eugenic stuff, killing millions of Jews because he wanted to spread the love of Jesus?
Well, Doug, I can imagine it because, let's face it, the Pharisees killed Jesus thinking they were doing God's work. It's kind of an unbelievable situation when you think about what Christianity supposedly stands for, and actually in actuality does stand for, and how often people mistake evil things for good things, okay? Saying that, Hitler was not one of these deceived guys. I think he knew exactly what, he was deceived, but he was not deceived in the sense of thinking he was doing Christian work.
Right.
He really had an agenda. I mean, ultimately, after he got done with the Jews and with the Slavs and the Poles, he really had some anti-Christian things he wanted to get taken care of.
Not only that, he frankly admitted that he was a pagan through and through.
And his occultic interests were very strong.
And he really was not that much interested. He thought that Christianity was a bastard child of Judaism. And so he really didn't have much respect at all for the Christian. He was brought up in a Catholic home, but his father was an agnostic, and so he really took after his father's point of view.
Yeah, saying that, Doug, was really interesting. He had Jerry Bergman, right? His book's called Hitler and the Nazi Darwinian Worldview. We'll hold this up here. And Jerry, as always, is meticulously researched and documented, footnoted. He really is an amazing guy. There's a reason, Doug, he's got nine degrees or whatever, and a couple of PhDs, and he's just an incredible guy, just a very humble and wonderful. I'm just glad to call him a friend. And but the point of it is, he really goes into this full bore. But Hitler was sort of a strange amalgam. And I'm not sure, I have not get to read the whole book of this yet, so, I want to just kind of start it. I'm familiar with some of the arguments, but Hitler was a strange amalgam of both occultic and Darwinian worldviews, which, by the way, is not all that unusual if you think about a modern incarnation of New Ageism, which has its premise is Darwinism.
Right.
Okay, it basically the idea,
a pagan religion.
It's a pagan, yes. So that's not really, and it's also not surprising, Doug. We've talked about this over the years, where you have the Darwinian concepts actually are not all that original and new in some respects. Ancient pagan believed spontaneous generation and things improved and got upward. Darwin, of course, grandfather, we've talked about this many times, Erasmus, dealt with his logo was from shells everything, and Darwin got a lot of his influence from that. But what Hitler did, he put Darwinian concepts on steroids. Okay, in other words, people today who are evolutionists want to distance themselves from Hitler, and they always poo-poo and make us sound like we're idiots. Because we bring this stuff. Well, we don't believe that now. I says, but it's a logical conclusion of Darwinian thinking, and it was a Darwinian Darwin himself promoted such things, and Jerry in his other book, The Dark Side of Darwin, talked about his sexism, his racism, his things that were implicit and even explicit in his books, specifically The Descent of Man, even more.
Well, what Darwin did, Haeckel amplified.
Yes.
And then Nietzsche added his old nihilism to the whole mix.
Yep.
And that made up really the German type of Darwinism that was promoted, that actively promoted eugenics. And it was the eugenics of Galton, who was Darwin's Francis Galton was Darwin's cousin.
Cousin, yes,
And
that's right.
he was the one who promoted the eugenics. He came up with the IQ test. He came up with all these other things that help people to measure whether they were fit or not to live, and that was some of the things that went into the whole Holocaust mental thinking.
Well, Doug, are you going to read a passage here?
Yeah.
But a thing that was interesting, we talked about earlier about the misnomer of Darwin doing Christian. How can you imagine Christians doing what he did? It's kind of like today when, I'm sorry, I hate to say it, but Christians justifying abortion. It's the slaughter of the infants. It's just nothing. It's killing. But this is when you've actually been born. But people who are now they're advocating infanticide, and how about the when after they're born, after a botched abortion, let them sit on the table and die? That's killing people. Okay. These people, there are people that claim to be Christians that are avowing this. No less a person than Henry Ford. I think he was raised as Quaker. I think, as if I'm not mistaken, supported eugenics, and was kind of a big anti-Semite. Okay, right. So Doug, Christians can make mistakes like that.
Right, but that isn't to say that the whole premise that Darwin was a Christian.
No, or that Hitler was a Christian. Hitler was not a Christian. He was not deceived or tricked by many people into doing these things. He was out and out really a pagan. He basically was called a good son of the church. There's even photographs of him and Mussolini. But basically he's playing the game.
That's what he was doing, yes.
Yeah, I mean...
Yeah, he would sometimes talk about God, but what he was doing was placating the church into thinking that that's what he was doing.
And it worked. A lot of the church got quiet and didn't do what they should have been doing, standing up for righteousness. I was like, look, we got a passage you wanted to read. Okay,
this is called, in one of the chapters, it talked about the God of the Nazis, and what the Nazis called biologism was an essential feature of National Socialism, which acquired its ideological base, but largely by applying biology, specifically Darwinian evolution, to humans. The Nazis taught that both the biological doctrine of race, the concept of living space, were, according to social Darwinism, fully justified by the eternal struggle for existence and the right of the stronger. The theory of heredity had a particular impact, influencing National Socialist marriage law and providing a logic for the euthanasia program. And the ideology of the Volk community was also derived from biologism, which is from the alleged primacy of species preservation over self-preservation, inferring a natural law of the subordination of the individual to the community. And so what was happening here was that Mein Kampf, which was...
history of Mein Kampf was his... He wrote that when he was in jail,
yeah. It was really translated to be My Struggle.
My Struggle, yes.
And what he was saying is that's a central concept of his ideology, that the basic force of human life was struggle against among opposing powers and force or dominance or destruction. And to lend support of that, they appealed to Charles Darwin for authority. You
know, it's very interesting, Doug. Earlier we were talking about things that evolutionists could use to support their premise. Equally, that creationists would support to use theirs. One of those, Doug, would be struggle. We come at it from an idea that the world has been broken and it's been cursed, and so we don't dispute the fact that there are struggles. What we dispute the fact is that from that you can extrapolate that things are going to get better based on your own struggle. That's not going to happen, okay? You could make certain things happen better economically or whatever, but the reality is, I'm looking at it, Doug, we're looking at a world right now that's getting harder and harder. Okay, as the United States seems to be going into more decline, and a lot of it I think it has to do because of our rejection, even in the Christian community, of Christian principles. We're not standing up for what we do. Darwinism is infecting the church, but what happens is, just as Hitler, he used the church when they had a big influence, but when he got to a point where he didn't have to, he didn't do it.
That's right.
That's what's happening here in this country. The same thing.
What started out was his first victims in this whole thing was what he called useless eaters. In other words, the people who were handicapped in some way, or they were unable to produce, or they were infirm, or and something like a hair lip would be a sentence to for death in this particular instance. And so that was where it started to go first. Then he started to target the Jews, the Gypsies, the Poles, and the Slavs.
Yep.
And so he made a vow that what he was going to do was actually wipe out the whole Russian continent.
Well, he tried to do it.
He tried to do that.
Well, they killed about 60 million
right.
Russians. Of course, Stalin killed almost as many on his own time. And of course, Stalin, what is he?
Right, yeah.
He's the communism is predicated upon, again, Darwinism.
Darwinism, and
yep,
so Stalinism was just about as bad as what happened with.
Yeah, the only thing with Stalin is he kept it basically into his own borders.
Right.
But he didn't even do that really after the war, when he come in and he made pretty despotic in all those Eastern Bloc countries for what, 50 years, 60, 70 years? Well, how long has it been? 45 to whenever they collapsed. But anyway, the long and the short of it is that when you talk about Hitler as being a Darwinian, what's interesting is the German culture, and they've had to fight their inner demons. France is not much better, okay? I'm sorry, I'm not trying to hammer everybody, because we have our own issues too in the United States, but they're very anti-Semitic. And when I say anti-Semitic, I mean really anti-Jew, okay? Their culture in Europe has been anti-Jew for centuries. Okay, from the ghettos and from the Middle Ages and all that kind of stuff. They've been they used to call them Christ killers, but then when Darwin got the upper hand, they're inferior races. Okay, in Hitler's worldview. But that coupled with the Darwinian thing really made it really almost a perfect storm. And suddenly you got the cultural antipathy towards a race of people. Or an ethnicity, and then couple that with the Darwinian worldview, which says survival of the fittest, but might makes right, basically. You put that together, it was inevitable stuff like this was going to happen. And I tell you, people think, well, we're not doing that here today. People today, Doug, say, we don't believe in social Darwinism. I said, yeah, I think people do.
Oh, yeah.
It's just that right now the church is getting placated because they're still a little strong in this country. But if the church goes down any farther, you watch what happens. I'm not saying we're going to go necessarily Hitler going to kill all the Jews, as long as they can constitute a major voting bloc. But the fact of the matter is, I could see it happening again all over. Oh, yeah. Because hatred and wickedness like this is epidemic to the culture. And that's where the Christian worldview, let alone the creationary one, says the world not only is broken, but the God of this world is Satan himself, and human beings tend to line up with him. Unless we have some mitigating influence, that is the work of Christ and the revelation of his gospel in our hearts, these kinds of things happen over and over again. The French Revolution, 150 years before Darwin even, but they rejected God, and that was,
In this case, Hitler had racist views of all kinds of different people. In this case, he strongly condemned both Africans and the missionaries who tried to convert them.
Does that sound like the Fuego del Fuego? I always get that. Del Fuego, the abhorrence that Darwin had when they tried to convert the savages, as he called them, and who reverted back to their old ways. Many of them did, but anyway, that was his own. He says it's useless to try to convert these people; they're inferior.
He believed that the result of religious teaching, humans no longer bother to breed the best for posterity, and then he was full of amazement at the small effect of the Christian faith in their own country, at the terrible godlessness, at this physically botched and hence spiritually degenerate rabble, and then they tried with the church's blessing to make up for it with the success of the Hottentots and the Zulus. And while our European peoples fall into a condition of physical and moral leprosy, the pious missionaries wandered off to Central Africa, set up Negro missionaries and missions until there too, through the primitive inferior, human beings degenerate into a rotten brood of bastards. So that's what Hitler thought of the blacks. He said they weren't worth saving. You know, they were.
See, the problem what we're saying here is everyone hates Hitler. In hindsight, but at the time, Hitler was not hated that much. I mean, they thought, oh, he had a few things wrong, and I've had people. I even said it myself. If Hitler would have died before World War II happened, he'd probably be remembered as a great leader with a few idiosyncrasies. He took the country, Germany, out of a depression from World War I that made ours look like a Sunday school picnic. He made the country feel good about themselves again. He invented the Volkswagen, or had the Volkswagen made. All these things, but the seeds of his destruction and the seeds of his evil were there from the very beginning, because it predated him with Darwinian thinking. And I tell you, social Darwinism, yes, it's hidden out. But I'm telling you, a lot of the stuff, Doug, with abortion and all this stuff is all about, it's the same kinds of stuff come to play again. It's the idea that there are certain things that we're better, we have higher quality. They can't be so blatant as they did in the social Darwin. In social Darwinian time, they were much more honest. Today, they're much more deceptive. You know,
Jerry sort of gives each chapter here a biography of some of.
Let's do some of the luminaries. He goes into all the luminaries. Well, not all of them, but the henchmen, if you will, and their philosophies. Do you have little thumbnails of some of the statements some of these guys made?
For example, Dr. Josef Mengele.
He
was Darwin's angel of death, and he was a doctor. And one of the things I see throughout this book is that it was the intelligentsia of the day, the professors, the doctors, and the PhDs who were the overall instigators of a lot of this. And what Mengele did in the concentration camps, he performed all these experiments on people.
Yep.
And he had one case, accounts where he would have people freeze to death. Put them out in the ice water, out naked, out in the cold, and just do scientific experiments to see when they would die under this experiment. Another experiment was where they put a person and gradually sucked all the air out of it until their lungs burst. And so there was all these different things that he did, and they published papers on this, of what the results of these different things were.
Yeah, the one thing you can never accuse the Nazis of being not leaving a paper trail. They documented everything, Doug. That's what makes it so insidious. They felt so confident in their moral, we would say immoral, mandate. They were promoting everything they said, and the world actually, for the most part, knew it. It wasn't. They didn't know that all the concentration camps and the Jewish ghettos, the Warsaw ghettos, and the Buchenwalds, Treblinkas, and Auschwitzes were. They didn't really know that a lot of it, but the people in Germany did. They knew what was going, but they kind of hid them out. And today, the people there today are still trying to live down that horrific thing. And I say, look, when you lose Christianity, when you lose the God of the Bible, you end up with problems that inevitably lead to things like this. As I said, you can see a French Revolution, anti-God. Russian Revolution, anti-God. You got the Iranian Revolution, false God. Okay? And they're all mob rule. They're all basically, let's go out and kill the infidel, kill the people, whatever, who doesn't live up to our expectations or what we think is right. Christianity is the only mitigating factor of that. The Buddhists, what are they going to do? They kind of hide out in their own little thing. And the same thing with the Hindus, man. They might kill some people too, but they're not going to go out and actually actively seek people who have an antithetical worldview and try to change them for the better. Christianity is the only one that does that. It's the only thing that does it. And you know what? If you think that's not good, then you're part of that mob mentality. You're part of that part that that needs the revelation of God. But I'm saying Hitler got consensus. Remember, Doug, we've said this for a long time. If you reject the God of the Bible, okay, starting from Genesis all the way through the Revelation, step and reject him, what you have left at best is consensus opinion. And therefore, Mother Teresa is just as wrong as Hitler was. Or conversely, Hitler is just as right as Mother Teresa was. Or any other, quote, saint. Inside, we know that's not right. Because there's a revelation that every human being has that there is a true God and he has communicated to us. But we, because of our rebellious nature, because of our heart that wants to do what we want to do, we want to go our own way, we bury our head in the sand. And things like this arise up. And millions get killed. Unfortunately, it has happened even within Christendom. That kind of evil can take over. But the fact of the matter is, and I'm not going to try to play numbers games, because obviously the atheistic revolutions have been far and away, I think, on orders of magnitude greater in slaughter. But there's been the wickedness of human beings without the mitigation and influence of Christ on the world would be so much worse. And you look at the history of civilization from ancient Egypt to the present day. They did stuff like that. Mengele we talk about with horror, right? Don't we? From our Christian worldview, we think about it with horror. The Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, they all did those kinds of things as well.
Josephus.
Oh my goodness!
Or
the
Usher,
Romans.
and talk about the horrible things that were done, beheading, skinning alive, and all that stuff in the ancient world. It was this is just that's a tough read when you're going through all this. This was a tough read, in terms of all the different things that people, all the things that they invent of evil things to do to people. I know,
and the pain, the suffering, and the misery that's caused by these kinds of things. What was so insidious about the Nazi is, and you brought up earlier, Doug, it was the intelligentsia. It makes you almost think that maybe Pol Pot was right when he slaughtered all those. The first thing they usually slaughter is the artists, the poets, and the academicians. Right. But what really amazes me, it's kind of like when I see people in the church giving into Darwin, Doug. They remind me of a man named Quisling. We've talked about him. Quisling was a guy who was a Norwegian high official who basically sold out Norway to the Nazis. Basically, Norway got conquered without firing a shot. Quislings are those people who basically pretend they're on your side, and they're really your enemy. And there are people in the church like that. We'll acknowledge that full bore. What we're saying is the content of Christianity is antithetical to everything that Nazism, communism, Marxism, Darwinism, those things are all inevitably dealing with a road of misery, pain, suffering, and just horrific consequences.
Now, what I wanted to do while we wrap this up is I wanted to just give some highlights of the
list the names of the characters. Yeah, the list the name of the.
Besides Mengele, who you had was Martin Bormann, who was Hitler's right-hand man. Yep. You had Heinrich Himmler. He was a real character.
He was a piece of work. Yep.
He was a mass murderer. Dr. Joseph Goebbels.
Goebbels. He was a propaganda minister.
Yeah.
Brilliant guy.
He's the father of the Holocaust. He's the mastermind behind all of it.
The final
Hermann
solution.
Goering comes on and he came into that. And then there's Reinhard Heydrich. He was a fervent anti-Christian in the Holocaust mastermind. And Dr. Alfred Rosenberg, he was the scribe of the New Gospel of Darwinism. Julius Streicher, he's the anti-Catholic Darwinist and Hitler's mentor. And then he has a chapter on the Lebensborn project. And that is where they took the different people that they thought were the Aryan race, and actually he pillaged a lot of the different towns and of their young people. Okay. And he put them in a breeding program.
Oh, yeah.
And that was an utter failure. And then he has a couple of interesting chapters at the end. The first one is on the Darwinism in the biology textbook in the Third Reich. And it shows some of the things that Haeckel had in his
Ernst Haeckel, the ultimate fraud.
And,
which has been fully documented for many, many times.
You know, it was showing the different progressions of
Right.
from fish on up through apes, through humans, you know, different facial expressions of that sort. And then finally, he wraps it up with what we can learn from attempts to apply Darwinism to society.
Yeah.
And so these are different things that Jerry brings out in this book. This is a powerful book. It is something that should be studied by anyone interested in history and
Again, it's called,
wanting to understand.
it's called Hitler and the Nazi Darwinian Worldview by Jerry Bergman. It's a must-read if you want to know some of the history of what's happened there. And again, we could barely scratch the surface of all the documentation that Jerry has of this. As I said, Hitler is known, but it was the interesting thing, the people that should have known better. Education is not going to rescue you. Education helps you know and learn things, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a moral basis, a moral compass. And that's where Hitler lost his way when he rejected the God of the Bible. Maybe he was brought up a certain way, but when he rejected that God of the Bible, he went down a dark path. And as so many others have had, I mentioned Pol Pot, but all these people that have gone into the atheistic worldviews, you know, whether from Robespierre and the French Revolution to all these other ones, they have horrible and horrific consequences, and the human misery and suffering index is high.
In this case, the total was 55 million people who
Wow.
died as a result of all of this.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Well, we hope you come to understand the importance of understanding why Darwinism affects your worldview, and what you need to do to remedy that is to understand also the Christian worldview.
Investigate its claims and see if the God of the Bible doesn't vindicate himself to you.
We'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.